The heat shimmered above the cobblestones that morning, distorting the crooked silhouettes of half-timbered houses that leaned over the narrow lanes of Strasbourg like gossiping neighbors. It was July 1518, and the summer had settled over the city with oppressive weight, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. In these medieval streets, where refuse collected in corners and the smell of tanneries mixed with bread baking in outdoor ovens, life moved at its usual rhythm. Merchants called out their wares. Children darted between cartwheels. Church bells marked the passing hours with their bronze tongues. Then Frau Troffea began to dance. She stepped into the street alone, this woman whose name history would remember when countless others faded into obscurity. Her feet found a rhythm that no one else could hear. She moved with neither joy nor celebration, her face a mask of something witnesses would later struggle to name. Not ecstasy, not madness, exactly. Something between compulsion and terror. Her body twisted and turned, her feet striking the stones in patterns that seemed to obey laws foreign to the natural world. The first onlookers smiled. Street performers were not uncommon, and perhaps this was merely a woman struck by some strange whim, some private celebration. But the smile faded from their lips as minutes became hours. As the sun climbed higher and the shadows shortened and disappeared, Frau Troffea continued her relentless dance. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Sweat darkened her clothing. Still, her feet moved, carrying her in circles and lines through the street, never stopping, never slowing. By afternoon, the curiosity had curdled into concern. This was no performance. Something had taken hold of her, some force that would not release its grip. She danced through the hottest part of the day when sensible people retreated indoors and even the dogs sought shade. She danced as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. She danced through the evening as candles were lit in windows and families gathered for their modest meals. And when darkness finally claimed the streets, when the city settled into the uneasy quiet of a summer night, witnesses swore they could still hear it. The sound of her feet against the stones, the desperate rhythm that would not end. Days passed. Frau Troffea danced on, and something impossible began to happen. Others joined her. Not by choice, they would later insist, but seized by the same invisible force that held her captive. One by one, then in groups, the citizens of Strasbourg were pulled into the dance. Within a week, dozens moved through the streets in that same terrible rhythm. Within a month, some accounts claim as many as 400 bodies writhed and spun through the medieval city, unable to stop, their feet bleeding, their bodies collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise and dance again. This is not folklore. This is documented history. City council records describe the measures taken. Physician reports detail the symptoms. Chronicles from multiple sources confirm the basic facts, though they struggle to explain what they witnessed. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most disturbing mysteries, a collective madness that defies easy explanation even now, more than 500 years later. What force could compel a human being to dance until their body failed? What psychological or physiological mechanism could spread such compulsion from one person to dozens, then hundreds? These are not merely historical questions. They cut to the heart of what we think we understand about the human mind, about free will, about the invisible threads that connect us to one another in ways we barely comprehend. In the pages ahead, we will walk those medieval streets and trace the steps of Frau Troffea and those who followed. We will sift through the theories, the explanations that range from ergot poisoning to mass psychogenic illness, from religious fervor to social contagion. We will examine what this plague reveals about the fragile boundary between control and chaos that exists in every human brain. And we will ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. Could it happen again? Could it be happening now, in different forms, with different rhythms? The dance that began on that scorching July morning did not end cleanly. It carried consequences that rippled through Strasbourg for years, leaving scars both physical and psychological on a city that thought it understood the limits of human behavior. It stands now as a warning and a mystery, a historical record of the day when something broke in the collective mind of a city, and the only response people could manage was to move their feet in patterns. They did not choose and could not stop. The question that haunted Strasbourg in 1518 haunts us still. When reason fails, when the body rebels against the mind's commands, when entire communities fall into shared madness, what does that tell us about the true nature of human consciousness? What does it reveal about the hidden vulnerabilities we carry, waiting for the right conditions to activate them? This is the story of the dancing plague. But more than that, it is a story about us. About the darkness that lurks in the space between what we choose and what we cannot help but do. It begins with one woman stepping into the street on a summer morning, her feet finding a rhythm that would echo through history. It begins with a mystery that has never been fully solved, and it begins with a warning we have yet to fully heed. The bread was black before it ever reached the oven. In the summer of 1518, the bakers of Strasbourg mixed sawdust, ground acorns, and clay into their dough, stretching the meager flour supplies that arrived sporadically from the devastated countryside. Those fortunate enough to afford even this adulterated loaf ate it quickly before the mold could spread further through the dense, heavy mass that sat like stone in empty stomachs. Those less fortunate scraped bark from trees in the city squares, boiled leather from old shoes, or simply waited to die. This was the reality of daily existence in Strasbourg as the second decade of the 16th century lurched toward its midpoint. A reality so grinding and relentless that death became not a fear, but a familiar neighbor, expected and almost welcome. The famine had arrived without warning in 1515, following a summer of such persistent rains that the grain rotted in the fields before harvest. The Ill River, which wound through the heart of Strasbourg, swelled beyond its banks, flooding the lowland farms that fed the city. What crop survived the deluge fell victim to an early frost that September, killing everything that remained. The city records, meticulously kept by the guilds and municipal authorities, tell a story written in steadily climbing numbers. Grain prices tripled within months. By 1516, they had increased tenfold. A measure of wheat that once cost a handful of pfennigs now required the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's weekly wage. Most residents of Strasbourg were not skilled craftsmen. The poor died first, as they always do. Bodies appeared in doorways each morning, curled against the cold stone of churches and guild halls where they had sought shelter during the night. The city employed men with carts to collect the dead before the sun rose high, a grim procession that moved through the narrow streets in the pre-dawn darkness. At first the bodies went to proper Christian burial in the churchyards of St. Thomas and St. Pierre. But as the months wore on and the famine deepened, the graves grew shallower and more crowded. Eventually, the dead were simply piled in mass graves beyond the city walls, covered with quicklime when it could be procured, left exposed when it could not. Wild dogs, themselves starving and desperate, learned to dig. Children suffered most visibly. Their bodies, lacking the reserves of adults, succumbed quickly to the effects of malnutrition. The symptoms were unmistakable to anyone who walked the streets. Distended bellies, thin limbs, skin stretched tight over prominent bones, and eyes that seemed too large for shrunken faces. These children sat listlessly in doorways or wandered the market squares, no longer even begging because they lacked the energy. Mothers watched their infants waste away, their breast milk dried up from their own starvation. The church records from St. Martin's Cathedral note a devastating statistic. In the year 1517, infant mortality in the parish reached 70%. 7 out of every 10 children born that year never saw their first birthday. But starvation alone was not the only horseman riding through Strasbourg. Disease followed famine as inevitably as night follows day. And the particular disease that stalked the city in those years carried not just death, but disgrace. Syphilis had arrived in Europe only 2 decades earlier, appearing first among the soldiers of the French King Charles VIII during his invasion of Italy in 1494. By 1500 it had spread across the continent, and by 1510 it had become endemic in urban centers like Strasbourg. The disease the locals called the French pox, which the French called the Italian disease, and which the Italians called the Spanish sickness, manifested with horrifying symptoms that marked its victims as surely as a brand. The initial chancre, appearing weeks after contact, often went unnoticed or was dismissed. But the secondary stage, which typically emerged 2 to 6 months later, could not be ignored. Rashes covered the body, particularly the palms and soles, Fever racked the sufferer. Hair fell out in clumps. Most horrifying were the lesions, the open sores that wept constantly and gave off a distinctive, putrid odor. In the crowded quarters of Strasbourg, where multiple families often shared single rooms and personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford, the disease spread rapidly. The city's bathhouses, once centers of social life, became vectors of transmission. By 1518, the municipal authorities had ordered most of them closed, a measure that only increased the general squalor. The third stage of syphilis, which could appear years after initial infection, transformed human beings into walking horrors. Gummas, soft tumor-like growths, erupted through the skin. Bones deteriorated, causing facial features to collapse inward. The nose would rot away, leaving a gaping hole in the center of the face. Blindness, paralysis, and madness followed. The afflicted wandered the streets, shunned by neighbors who recognized the marks of divine judgment when they saw them. For this was not merely a disease of the body but a punishment from God, clear evidence of moral corruption and sin. The clergy preached this message from every pulpit, and the people, desperate for explanation, embraced it with fervent belief. God was angry. This much seemed undeniable to the residents of Strasbourg as they surveyed the cascade of catastrophes befalling their city. The famine, the disease, the social disorder, the sense that the very fabric of existence was unraveling, all pointed to divine wrath. But why? What had the people done to deserve such punishment? The answers varied depending on whom you asked, but certain themes emerged with consistent frequency. The church was corrupt, grown fat on indulgences and simony, while the people starved. Martin Luther had published his 95 Theses just months earlier in October of 1517, nailing them to the church door in Wittenberg and igniting a theological firestorm that swept through German-speaking lands. In Strasbourg, his ideas found fertile ground among a population already questioning why God seemed to have abandoned them. The end times were surely approaching. This conviction took hold in the popular imagination with the force of absolute certainty. Preachers spoke of the Book of Revelation, of the 7 seals and the 4 horsemen, and the tribulations that would precede Christ's return. The signs were everywhere for those with eyes to see. Famine, pestilence, war, death, all present in abundance. Strange phenomena were reported and passed from mouth to mouth, growing more elaborate with each retelling. A woman in the north of the city gave birth to a 2-headed calf. Blood rained from the sky over the vineyards to the south. A statue of the Virgin Mary in St. Nicholas Church supposedly wept tears of blood. Whether these events actually occurred mattered less than the fact that people believed they occurred needed them to occur, because they confirmed what everyone already knew in their bones. The natural order had been suspended, and supernatural forces now held sway. Among these supernatural forces, none loomed larger in the collective consciousness of Strasbourg than St. Vitus. This 3rd-century Christian martyr, supposedly tortured and thrown into a pot of boiling oil before being fed to lions, had become the patron saint of dancers, actors, and most significantly, for the residents of Strasbourg, those suffering from epilepsy and chorea. Throughout the Middle Ages, a condition of uncontrollable dancing was attributed to the curse of St. Vitus, striking down those who had failed to honor him properly or who had danced irreverently on his feast day. The phenomenon had occurred before in various locations across German-speaking Europe. In 1374, dozens of people in Aachen had been seized by uncontrollable dancing that lasted for days. Similar outbreaks were recorded in Cologne, Metz, and Strasbourg itself in 1418, exactly 100 years before. The memory of that earlier outbreak had been preserved in the city's collective memory, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. Those afflicted, according to the accounts, had danced through the streets for days or weeks, unable to stop, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died. Others recovered but were never quite the same afterward. The cause was universally understood. They had offended St. Vitus, and he had responded with his terrible curse. The cure, when it worked at all, involved pilgrimages to his shrine, special masses said in his honor, and penance appropriate to whatever sin had triggered his wrath. The church maintained careful records of these cases, studied them for patterns, and issued guidelines for how priests should respond when St. Vitus struck. By the summer of 1518, the city existed in a state of collective psychological fracture. Imagine living under such conditions day after day, month after month, year after year. You wake each morning uncertain whether you will eat that day. Your children are dying. Your neighbors are dying. Perhaps you are dying slowly yourself from disease or malnutrition. The authorities offer no help because they are overwhelmed, struggling merely to maintain basic order and dispose of the mounting dead. The church, which should provide comfort and explanation, instead tells you that God is punishing you for sins you may not even be aware you committed. Heretical ideas spread through the streets, challenging everything you were taught to believe, adding theological uncertainty to material desperation. The psychological toll of such sustained trauma cannot be overstated. Modern research into mass psychogenic illness has demonstrated repeatedly that communities under severe stress become susceptible to outbreaks of shared physical symptoms that have no organic cause. The mind, overwhelmed by circumstances it cannot control and cannot escape, manifests its distress through the body. Tremors, seizures, paralysis, and yes, uncontrollable movement. All can result from psychological pressure that exceeds the individual's capacity to cope. But multiply that individual pressure across an entire population. Create conditions where everyone is traumatized simultaneously, where the normal social structures that provide support and resilience have themselves broken down, and you create the perfect environment for mass hysteria. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 did not understand psychology or psychogenic illness. They understood sin and punishment, saints and curses, divine will and supernatural forces. They lived in a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin and permeable, where spiritual realities were as concrete and tangible as the bread they could not afford. When the breaking point finally came, when the accumulated weight of famine and disease and fear and desperation became too much to bear, their minds and bodies responded in the only way that made sense within their understanding of how the world worked. Saint Vitus had been watching. Saint Vitus had been waiting. And in July of 1518, Saint Vitus struck. The dance began to spread on the third day after Frau Troffea first took to the streets. Her neighbor, a woman named Frau Lubus, joined her in the square. Witnesses who recorded the event described how Lubus emerged from her home in the early morning hours, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the visible world. She did not speak to her husband as she passed him in the doorway. She did not acknowledge her children crying out for her. She simply walked into the street and began to move, her body adopting the same relentless rhythm that had consumed Troffea. Within hours, 3 more joined them. Then 7. Then 12. The physicians who observed these early additions to the dance described a pattern that would repeat itself with horrifying consistency over the coming weeks. The afflicted would appear normal one moment, going about their daily business, tending to chores, speaking with neighbors. Then something would shift behind their eyes. Their gaze would become distant, unfocused. Their bodies would stiffen momentarily, as if seized by an invisible hand, and then they would begin to move. Some started with a simple swaying, a rhythmic rocking that grew more pronounced with each passing minute. Others launched immediately into violent jerking motions, their limbs flailing as if controlled by strings pulled by a demented puppeteer. By the end of the first week, more than 30 people danced in the streets of Strasbourg. The city's authorities, initially dismissive of what they considered a bizarre but isolated incident, now faced an undeniable crisis. These were not performers or drunken revelers. These were ordinary citizens, men and women from all stations of life, seized by a compulsion that defied every rational explanation. Among the dancers was a baker named Herr Vogeli, a man known throughout his neighborhood for his reliability and his strong constitution. His apprentice later testified that Vogeli had been kneading dough when the compulsion took him. His hands stopped moving in the familiar pattern of his work and began instead to move in the air, fingers tracing invisible patterns. Then his feet began to shuffle, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. He abandoned his shop, leaving the oven fires burning, and joined the growing mass of dancers in the square. His wife tried to restrain him, clutching at his arms, pleading with him to stop, but he moved with a strength that seemed impossible for a man of his years. He pushed past her without seeming to recognize her face, without responding to her voice calling his name. The physical deterioration of the dancers became apparent within days. The initial frenzy, which some observers had foolishly hoped might exhaust itself quickly, showed no signs of abating. The dancers moved continuously, hour after hour, without rest, without sleep, without food or water, unless it was forced upon them. Their feet, encased in the rough leather shoes common to the period, began to bleed. The cobblestones of Strasbourg's streets became marked with dark stains that witnesses said they could still see weeks later, even after rain had fallen. When the dancers' shoes wore through completely, they continued barefoot, the soles of their feet splitting open, exposing raw flesh to the harsh stone beneath. A physician named Paracelsus von Hohenheim, though he would not arrive in Strasbourg until several weeks into the outbreak, later compiled accounts from colleagues who had witnessed the dancing in its early stages. These records describe in clinical detail the physical trauma inflicted by the unceasing movement. The dancers' legs became swollen, inflamed with infection from the constant impact. Their joints, particularly in the ankles and knees, suffered damage that would prove permanent for those who survived. Some dancers moved with such violence that they dislocated their own shoulders, or broke their fingers against walls and other obstacles they encountered in their frenzied paths. The most disturbing aspect, according to nearly all contemporary accounts, was the dancers' expressions. Those who looked into their faces reported seeing nothing, an emptiness that suggested the person they had known was no longer present. Frau Troffea's husband continued to visit her daily as she danced, calling her name, begging her to stop, to come home, to acknowledge him in any way. She never did. Her eyes, witnesses said, were open but unseeing. When people spoke directly to the dancers, attempting to reason with them or command them to stop, they received no response. It was as if the dancers existed in a separate reality, one where the voices and pleas of their loved ones simply did not penetrate. By the 10th day, the number of dancers had exceeded 100. The city council convened emergency sessions, bringing in physicians, priests, and learned men from the university to explain the phenomenon and recommend a course of action. The medical theories of the time offered several explanations, none of which seemed adequate to the scale of what was unfolding. Some physicians attributed the dancing to an imbalance of the four humors, specifically an excess of blood creating a hot, moist temperament that manifested in uncontrollable movement. They recommended bloodletting, a standard treatment for countless ailments, but when applied to the dancers, it only weakened them further without stopping their relentless motion. Others suggested natural causes, celestial influences, the alignment of planets creating conditions that drove certain susceptible individuals to madness. Astrologers were consulted, charts were drawn up, but these offered no practical solution to the crisis multiplying in the streets. The dancers continued their macabre performance, indifferent to theories about Saturn's position or the influence of Mars. The deaths began in the second week. The exact number is disputed by historical records, but contemporary chronicles agree that people began to die while still moving, their bodies simply giving out after days without rest. A woman identified in records only as Adelheid collapsed on the 12th day of the outbreak. Witnesses described how she had been dancing with particular violence, spinning and leaping, in ways that seemed to defy the exhaustion that must have consumed her. Then, mid-spin, she fell. Those who reached her body first reported that her heart had given out, burst from the strain of continuous exertion. She was not yet 30 years old. A man named Hans Decker died of a stroke while dancing, his face contorting suddenly before he pitched forward onto the stones. Another woman, whose name was not recorded but whose death was witnessed by a priest who later wrote about it, simply danced until her body could no longer support itself. She grew thinner with each passing day, her skin taking on a gray pallor, her movements becoming increasingly erratic and uncoordinated. On the 16th day of her affliction, she fell and did not rise. The priest who administered last rites noted that even in her final moments, her legs continued to twitch and jerk, as if the compulsion to dance persisted even as life left her body. The authorities, faced with mounting deaths and no effective intervention, made a decision that in retrospect appears almost incomprehensible. Rather than attempting to forcibly restrain the dancers, they decided to encourage them. The theory, supported by some physicians of the time, held that the affliction was caused by hot blood and that the only cure was to let it burn itself out through continuous dancing. The city council hired musicians, built stages, and created designated dancing areas where the afflicted could move without obstruction. They believed that by facilitating the dance, they would help the dancers exhaust the mysterious force that drove them. This decision proved catastrophic, with professional musicians providing constant accompaniment, with drums and pipes and stringed instruments creating an endless soundtrack of driving rhythm. The dancing intensified. More people fell under the compulsion. The music seemed to act as a catalyst, drawing in those who might have otherwise resisted. By the end of the third week, approximately 200 people danced day and night in the streets and squares of Strasbourg. The descriptions from this period take on an increasingly nightmarish quality. Chronicles speak of the sounds of the city changing, the normal noise of commerce and daily life drowned out by the constant rhythm of feet striking stone, by the wheezing gasps of dancers struggling to breathe, by the music that never stopped. The smell, too, became overwhelming as the dancers lost control of their bodily functions, as infection set into their wounds, as the summer heat of July intensified the stench of unwashed bodies locked in continuous motion. A merchant named Johann Geck wrote a letter to his brother in Basel, describing the scene in Strasbourg's main square. He told of how the dancers' clothing hung in tatters, how their hair became matted with sweat and blood, how some danced until their eyes rolled back in their heads, yet still their bodies continued to move. He described attempting to speak to a dancer he had known, a woman named Margarethe, who had sold vegetables in the market. She did not recognize him, did not respond when he called her name. Her face, he wrote, was like that of a corpse that had not yet realized it was dead. The number continued to grow. 400 is the figure most commonly cited in historical records, though some accounts suggest the number may have been even higher. Families were torn apart as mothers abandoned children. Husbands left wives, young men and women who should have been working their trades or tending their homes instead whirled and stamped in the public squares. The economic impact on the city became severe as shops closed, as trade suffered, as entire households were disrupted by the loss of members to the dance. The medical establishment remained completely baffled. Physicians accustomed to dealing with plague, with fevers, with injuries and infections, found themselves confronting something that fit no known category of disease. The affliction was clearly spreading from person to person, suggesting contagion, yet it did not follow the patterns of known contagious diseases. There was no obvious vector of transmission, no physical contact necessary for the compulsion to jump from one person to another. Some victims began dancing after watching the others for extended periods. Some fell under the spell without having witnessed the dancing at all, seized in their homes or workshops by an urge they could not name or resist. The dancers themselves, when they briefly paused or were forcibly restrained long enough to be questioned, could offer no explanation for their behavior. Most could not remember beginning to dance. Those few who retained enough awareness to speak described an overwhelming compulsion, an absolute necessity to move that overpowered every other thought or need. One man, restrained long enough to give testimony to a physician, said it felt as though his body was being moved by an external force, as though he was a passenger in his own flesh, watching but not controlling the endless motion. As July turned to August, as the death toll mounted and the number of dancers reached its peak, Strasbourg existed in a state of collective terror. This was not a distant threat or an abstract danger. This was a phenomenon visible on every street corner, audible at every hour of day and night, impossible to ignore or deny. The dancing had transformed the city into a vision of hell, where men and women moved like puppets with no puppeteer, dancing themselves to exhaustion, injury, and death, while the music played on and on and on. The City Council of Strasbourg convened an emergency session during the first week of August 1518, as the bodies continued to mount. These were not foolish men. They were the elected representatives of one of the Holy Roman Empire's most prosperous cities, advisors who had guided Strasbourg through plague, famine, and war. Yet the solution they proposed that summer day would transform an already nightmarish situation into something far worse. a decision so bizarre that historians still struggle to comprehend how intelligent, educated officials could have chosen a path that would accelerate death rather than prevent it. The council's reasoning followed a certain twisted logic that made sense within the medical understanding of their time. The afflicted were dancing because of hot blood, according to the physicians who advised the council. This overheated blood created an imbalance in the humors, and the only way to restore equilibrium was to allow the heat to burn itself out. The dancers needed to continue moving until the fever passed, until the corruption worked its way through their systems and emerged as sweat and exhaustion. To stop them mid-dance, the doctors warned, would drive the heated blood inward toward vital organs, causing immediate death. And so the council made their catastrophic choice. They would not restrain the dancers. They would not confine them or attempt to break the spell through force. Instead, they would help them dance. They would provide official, municipal support for the affliction, transforming a medical emergency into a sanctioned public event. On August 4th, 1518, the council issued their decree. Stages would be constructed throughout the city. Professional musicians would be hired at city expense. Guild halls would be requisitioned and converted into dance floors. The grain market at the Place du Corbeau would be cleared of its normal commerce and given over entirely to the dancers. The transformation happened with terrifying speed. Within 2 days, carpenters had erected platforms in 3 locations across Strasbourg. The largest stage stood in the horse market, a wooden structure hastily built but sturdy enough to support dozens of dancers simultaneously. Another rose in the square outside the Kaufhaus, the merchants' hall that normally hosted the city's commercial transactions. The third appeared near the cathedral itself, close enough that the priests could hear the music echoing off the ancient stones while they performed their liturgies inside. The city's purse opened to hire musicians, professionals who could play in shifts to maintain continuous music. Guildhall records show payments made to pipers, drummers, and horn players throughout August. These were not street performers or amateurs. The council wanted the finest musicians available, men who could keep a steady rhythm for hours, who understood the tempos and structures needed to sustain continuous dancing. They were instructed to play without ceasing, rotating in 8-hour shifts, so that the music never stopped, not during daylight, not during darkness, not for any reason whatsoever. The guild halls received their orders on August 5th. The Shoemakers Guild, the Bakers Guild, the Tanners Guild, all were commanded to open their meeting halls to the dancers. These were substantial buildings, structures with high ceilings and strong floors designed to accommodate large gatherings. Now they would serve as auxiliary dance spaces, supplementing the outdoor stages. The guildmasters protested, citing lost business and disrupted schedules, but the council's word was final. This was an emergency measure for the public good. The grain market clearance proved most controversial. The Place du Corbeau served as the city's primary location for buying and selling wheat, barley, rye, and oats. Closing it meant disrupting Strasbourg's food supply during the late summer harvest season, precisely when merchants needed to stockpile grain for the coming winter. But the council deemed the dancers' need more urgent. Grain traders were redirected to smaller, less convenient locations. The cobblestones where farmers normally displayed their sacks of wheat became another dance floor, another space where the afflicted could spin and leap under municipal supervision. Contemporary accounts describe the surreal atmosphere that descended over Strasbourg once the city's plan went into effect. Sebastian Brandt, an older man by 1518, witnessed the transformation from his home near the cathedral. He wrote of looking out his window at dawn and seeing the stages already occupied, bodies in motion as the first light touched the city's rooftops. The music began before sunrise, the drummers establishing their rhythm in the gray pre-dawn darkness, joined gradually by pipes and horns as more musicians arrived to begin their shifts. Daniel Specklin, another Strasbourg resident, recorded observations that capture the uncanny quality of those days. He described walking through the city on ordinary business, heading to purchase bread or cloth, and encountering scenes that seemed torn from a fever dream. In the horse market, dancers moved in frantic circles on the wooden stage while a crowd gathered to watch. Some in the audience wept, others stared in mute horror. A few, terrifyingly, began to sway in sympathy with the dancers' movements, as if the affliction might spread through observation alone. The musicians played their instruments with grim determination, following their contracts to the letter. They maintained steady tempos, repetitive melodies designed to support continuous movement. Traditional dance tunes formed the core of their repertoire, familiar melodies that the dancers' bodies seemed to recognize and respond to automatically. Witnesses reported that when the tempo increased, the dancers accelerated their movements to match. When it slowed, they moved more languidly but never stopped entirely. Inside the guild halls, the scene grew even more disturbing. These enclosed spaces trapped the heat and the smell. The dancers sweated profusely in the August warmth, their clothing soaked through, their faces red and contorted with exhaustion. The music echoed off the walls, creating a disorienting cacophony. Yet still, the official policy held. The musicians kept playing. The dancers kept moving. The authorities watched and believed they were helping. The tragic irony became apparent within days. Rather than burning out the fever, the continuous dancing accelerated death. The first fatalities under the new system occurred on August 7th, just 3 days after the council's decree. A woman collapsed on the horse market stage around midday, falling so suddenly that nearby dancers trampled her before they could stop their own compulsive movements. She was carried away, but died within the hour. Witnesses reported she had been dancing for perhaps 30 hours straight, sustained by the professional musicians' relentless rhythms. More deaths followed in rapid succession. The heat of mid-August, combined with extreme physical exertion, created lethal conditions. Dancers suffered heart attacks on the stages. Some died from strokes brought on by dehydration and overheating. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies finally surrendering after days of continuous movement. The musicians played on, following their instructions, while corpses were removed from the dance floors and new dancers took their places. The municipal records show the progression clearly, though the scribes who kept those records must have written their entries with trembling hands. August 8th, 2 dead. August 9th, 4 dead. August 10th, 3 dead. The numbers climbed day by day as the city's well-intentioned intervention transformed into a death machine, grinding through victims with bureaucratic efficiency. Medical observers began to raise concerns, but quietly, hesitantly. They had advised the council initially, after all. Admitting error now meant accepting responsibility for the deaths that had resulted. Some physicians suggested modifications to the policy, perhaps limiting the dancing to certain hours, or requiring rest periods. But the council had committed to their course of action. Changing direction would mean acknowledging their catastrophic mistake before all of Strasbourg. The professional musicians found themselves in an impossible position. They were being paid to play, and play they did, but some later reported nightmares about the faces of the dancers, about the way their eyes seemed empty while their bodies jerked and spun. A piper named Hans, mentioned briefly in guild records, apparently refused to continue after the first week and forfeited his payment. How many others wanted to stop but kept playing because they needed the money, because they had families to feed, because refusing a city contract could mean losing their professional licenses? The stages themselves became infamous locations, places that Strasbourg residents would avoid for years afterward. The horse market platform, the Kaufhaus Square stage, the Cathedral Plaza structure, each acquired its own gruesome reputation. People reported feeling uneasy near these sites even after the platforms were dismantled, as if the suffering that occurred there had somehow soaked into the ground itself. The guild halls suffered similar stigmatization. After the crisis passed, some guildmasters reported that members refused to enter the buildings where the dancing had occurred. The spaces felt contaminated, cursed. Several guilds eventually sold their traditional halls and relocated to new buildings, abandoning structures that had served their trades for generations, rather than continue meeting in places associated with such horror. The grain market at Place du Corbeau took longest to recover. Even after normal commerce resumed, farmers and merchants conducting business there described an atmosphere of lingering dread. The cobblestones where grain sacks should have rested had instead supported dancing feet, dozens of people spinning themselves to death while the city watched and encouraged them. By mid-August, with perhaps 15 dead and dozens more still dancing, some council members began privately questioning their decision. But, publicly, officially, the policy continued. The musicians played on. The stages remained. The guild halls stayed open to dancers. The momentum of institutional commitment carried the disastrous intervention forward even as its architects began to doubt. This was the true horror of Strasbourg's response. Not merely that it failed, but that it failed so completely while appearing rational and humane. These officials genuinely believed they were helping. They thought their solution represented enlightened municipal governance, a progressive approach to a medical crisis that showed Strasbourg's sophistication and resources. Instead, they had accelerated a tragedy, transforming a mysterious affliction into a systematic killing operation administered with civic pride and careful accounting. The professional musicians' fees appear in city ledgers alongside payments for road repairs and bridge maintenance, bureaucratic records that treat mass death as just another municipal expense, requiring proper documentation. Somewhere in Strasbourg's archives, if they survived the centuries, are receipts signed by pipers and drummers, acknowledging payment for helping people dance themselves to death. In the summer heat of 1518, as bodies twisted and feet pounded the cobblestones of Strasbourg without rest, the city's leaders faced a horrifying question that demanded an answer. What force could compel dozens, then hundreds of their citizens to dance until blood seeped from their shoes? What power could turn mothers, merchants, and servants into writhing figures who could not stop moving, even as exhaustion carved deep shadows beneath their eyes? The physicians had offered their theories about hot blood and astrological influences, but there was another explanation that resonated far more deeply with the people of Strasbourg, one that emerged from the bedrock of their spiritual understanding. The dancers were cursed. They had been struck down by the wrath of Saint Vitus himself. This was not merely superstition to the people of 16th century Strasbourg. It was theological fact, woven into the fabric of how they understood the world and their place within it. Saints were not distant, abstract figures, but active participants in daily life, capable of blessing those who honored them and punishing those who did not. And Saint Vitus, the young martyr, who had died centuries earlier during the Roman persecutions, held particular power over involuntary movement, convulsions, and the terrifying loss of control over one's own body. To the citizens watching their neighbors dance themselves toward death, the connection was unmistakable. This was not disease in any ordinary sense. This was divine punishment. The cult of Saint Vitus had deep roots throughout the Germanic regions, extending back through centuries of devotion and belief. According to the hagiographies, Vitus had been a young Christian boy, perhaps only 12 or 13 years old, living in Sicily during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. His father, a pagan, had tried desperately to turn his son away from Christianity, but Vitus remained steadfast in his faith. When his father's persuasion failed, he delivered the boy to the authorities, who subjected him to torture. But divine intervention protected the young martyr. When he was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil, he emerged unharmed. When he was cast before lions, the beasts refused to touch him. Finally, according to legend, he died praising God, his faith unshaken to the last breath. Over the centuries, Saint Vitus became associated with a particular category of afflictions, those involving uncontrolled movement. Epilepsy, convulsions, chorea, any condition that robbed a person of mastery over their own limbs fell under his domain. The very name given to certain movement disorders, Saint Vitus dance, testified to this connection. But the saint's power worked in two directions. He could heal these afflictions, granting relief to those who properly venerated him and made the right offerings at his shrines. Or he could inflict them, sending a burning curse into the blood of those who had offended him, causing their bodies to move in endless, agonized motion. This curse, the people of Strasbourg believed, was exactly what they were witnessing in the summer of 1518. The question that consumed the authorities was not whether Saint Vitus had sent this plague, but why. What had the people of Strasbourg done to earn such terrible wrath? Preachers searched for answers in recent events, in moral failures, in the slow drift toward corruption that they claimed had infected the city. Some pointed to the growing wealth inequality, the way prosperous merchants lived in luxury while the poor scraped by on the edge of starvation. Others identified specific sins, pride, greed, lust, the failure to properly observe holy days. Still others suggested the dancers themselves had offended the saint, perhaps by dancing on his feast day or in some other act of sacrilege. The precise transgression mattered less than the underlying belief that this was punishment, and that only through proper religious action could the curse be lifted. As the dancing continued day after day, with new victims joining the grotesque parade, the city council made a decision. They would organize a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Vitus at Saverne, a town nestled in the mountains, some 30 miles southwest of Strasbourg. There, at a chapel dedicated to the saint, the afflicted would be brought to pray, to make offerings, and to seek the miraculous intervention that might finally grant them peace. This was not a minor undertaking. The dancers were in no condition to walk such a distance under their own power. They would need to be transported by wagon, restrained when necessary to prevent them from injuring themselves during the journey. Musicians would accompany them, playing pipes and drums to provide some structure to their movements, some rhythm that might make the curse slightly more bearable until they reached the holy site. The pilgrimage that departed Strasbourg in late August of 1518 must have been a sight both solemn and disturbing. Wagons creaked along the road, carrying dancers whose feet still moved in restless jerking patterns even as they lay bound. Family members walked alongside, faces etched with worry and desperate hope. Priests led prayers, their voices rising and falling as the procession wound through the countryside. Other citizens joined as well, seeking their own intercession from the saint, or perhaps hoping that their presence would add weight to the collective supplication. The road to Saverne became a ribbon of faith and fear stretched across the landscape. The shrine itself was a place of considerable importance in the regional devotional landscape. The chapel of St. Vitus at Saverne had drawn pilgrims for generations, people suffering from shaking sicknesses, from convulsions, from any affliction that manifested as unwanted movement. The structure stood in a grove considered sacred, surrounded by trees that whispered in the mountain wind. Inside, candles flickered before images of the young martyr, their flames casting shadows that danced across the walls. Offerings from previous suppliants crowded the space, small wooden carvings of limbs that had been healed, coins pressed into wax, letters describing miraculous cures. The very air seemed thick with accumulated prayer, with centuries of desperate petitions rising like incense. When the dancers from Strasbourg arrived, they were brought before the altar with great ceremony. The rituals that followed combined Orthodox Catholic practice with regional traditions specific to the cult of St. Vitus. Priests led prayers in Latin, invoking the saint's mercy and asking him to lift the curse he had sent. The afflicted were blessed with holy water drawn from a spring near the chapel, water believed to carry special healing properties due to its association with the saint. Red cloths were draped over the dancers, the color chosen for its connection to blood, the very substance believed to have been heated and corrupted by the saint's curse. Special masses were said, with the afflicted positioned as close to the altar as possible, so that the power of the consecrated host might reach them more directly. The offerings made on behalf of the dancers reflected both the wealth that could be marshaled and the depth of desperation. Wealthy families contributed silver coins, fine fabrics, and commissioned masses to be said in perpetuity for the saint's favor. Those with less means offered what they could: candles, simple food, promises of future service to the church. Some brought wax models shaped like legs and feet, symbolic representations of the afflicted limbs they hoped would be healed. These votive offerings were placed before the saint's image, physical manifestations of the intangible prayers that filled the chapel. The priest recorded the most valuable donations, ensuring that the saint would be properly honored and that the institution maintaining his shrine would be sustained. But perhaps the most striking ritual involved dancing itself. In a practice that seems paradoxical, the afflicted were encouraged to dance within the chapel, to offer their uncontrolled movements as a form of worship. The logic, rooted in medieval theological understanding, held that by transforming the curse into an act of devotion, its nature could be changed. What had been punishment might become supplication. The involuntary could be made voluntary through the dancer's intent, through their conscious decision to dedicate each agonized step to the saint's glory. So within the sacred space, as incense smoke curled toward the vaulted ceiling, the dancers moved in their strange, compulsive patterns, reframing their torment as prayer. The chronicles report that some dancers found relief at Saverne. After hours or days of prayer, of ritual, of lying before the altar in exhausted supplication, Certain individuals felt the compulsion begin to fade. Their movements slowed, became less frantic, and finally ceased altogether. They stood on trembling legs, weak from their ordeal, but mercifully still. These miraculous cures were recorded with great care. Testimonies taken from the healed and their families, evidence that the saint had heard and answered. Such cases reinforced the supernatural framework through which everyone understood the plague. If prayer could cure the dancing, then clearly divine power had caused it. The logic was circular but complete, self-reinforcing. Yet others found no such relief. Despite the prayers, the offerings, the holy water and blessed cloths, some dancers continued their terrible motion. They were kept at the shrine for extended periods, sometimes weeks, in the hope that continued intercession might eventually succeed. When it did not, explanations had to be found that preserved the theological framework. Perhaps these individuals had committed sins too grave for easy forgiveness. Perhaps their faith was insufficient, tainted by doubt even as they prayed. Perhaps the saint, in his divine wisdom, was testing them, requiring greater sacrifice or deeper repentance before granting his mercy. The failure of miracles to materialize for everyone did not shake the belief system, but rather generated more elaborate theological reasoning to explain the inconsistencies. The authorities in Strasbourg watched the results from Saverne with intense interest. Those who returned healed were paraded through the streets as proof that the correct interpretation had been found and the proper response implemented. Their testimonies were shared widely, offering hope to those still afflicted and validation for the city's investment in the pilgrimage. But the dancing did not stop entirely. New cases continued to appear even as others resolved, a pattern that would persist through late summer and into early autumn. This ongoing nature of the plague required repeated pilgrimages, multiple rounds of ritual intervention, a sustained campaign of supernatural negotiation. The expense was considerable, but to the medieval mind, there was no alternative worth considering. When faced with a phenomenon that defied ordinary explanation, when watching fellow humans transformed into instruments of some incomprehensible force, the supernatural framework provided both explanation and action plan. It answered the why even as it offered a path forward. The plague was punishment, which meant humans had agency in resolving it through proper religious action. This was, in its way, more comforting than admitting ignorance, than facing a universe in which such horrors could occur without reason or solution. The shrine at Saverne became, for that summer and autumn, the focal point of Strasbourg's desperate hope. The path between city and chapel was worn deep by feet and wagon wheels, by the traffic of affliction seeking cure. And through it all, the figure of Saint Vitus loomed large, a young martyr dead for more than 1,000 years, yet still believed to hold the power of life and death, of movement and stillness, of curse and cure. In the minds of 16th century Christians, the boundary between past and present, between heaven and earth, was far more permeable than modern sensibilities can easily grasp. The dead lived on through their saintly power, and that power shaped events in the material world with tangible, terrible force. The dancers collapsed in the streets of Strasbourg in 1518, their feet bloodied and broken, their minds shattered by weeks of relentless movement. But here is what makes the skin crawl, what transforms this historical curiosity into something far more sinister. Strasbourg was not the first. It was not even unusual. The dancing plague was not an isolated madness that descended once upon a medieval town and then vanished into history. It was a recurring nightmare that stalked Europe for more than a century and a half, appearing and reappearing like a dark tide that would not recede. The first great wave struck in the year 1374 in the city of Aachen, and it arrived with a fury that makes the Strasbourg outbreak seem almost restrained by comparison. It began in July, when the summer heat pressed down upon the cobblestones and the air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting refuse. A group of people, witnesses claimed it was perhaps 24 at first, began dancing in the streets. But unlike the solitary start in Strasbourg, where Frau Troffea danced alone before others joined, the Aachen outbreak erupted like a fire catching dry timber. Within days, hundreds were dancing. Within weeks, the phenomenon had spread beyond Aachen's walls, leaping from town to town like a contagion carried on invisible wings. The dancers moved through the streets of Cologne, Liege, Tongeren, and Utrecht. They danced through villages whose names have been lost to time, leaving trails of broken bodies and shattered minds across the Low Countries and the Rhineland. Contemporary chroniclers, their hands trembling as they wrote, claimed that thousands were afflicted. Some modern historians suggest this might be exaggeration born of fear, but the sheer number of independent accounts from different cities suggests that whatever happened in 1374 was massive in scale. The Aachen dancers displayed behaviors that would become grimly familiar in later outbreaks, yet with their own distinct and disturbing characteristics. They formed long chains, holding hands or linking arms, and snaked through the streets in writhing lines that reminded observers of serpents. They sang as they danced, but the songs were strange, discordant things that seemed to come from throats not entirely human. Many wore garlands of flowers in their hair, a touch of celebration that made the whole spectacle even more unsettling. Here were people dancing themselves to death while crowned with summer blooms. But the Aachen outbreak revealed something darker than Strasbourg would later show. These dancers spoke of visions. They screamed about demons that pursued them, about rivers of blood they had to wade through, about the sky splitting open to reveal hell itself. Some claimed they danced through a sea of blood that rose to their knees, though the streets remained dry and dusty to everyone watching. Others insisted they were being chased by devils with pitchforks who would impale them if they stopped moving. The psychological torment seemed as severe as the physical destruction. The religious authorities responded with a mixture of compassion and revulsion. Priests performed exorcisms on the dancers, believing them possessed by malevolent spirits. Some of the afflicted were taken to chapels dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint invoked against epilepsy and disorders that caused uncontrollable movement. This connection would give the phenomenon one of its names, Saint Vitus's dance, though whether the dancers sought the saint's help or were dragged there by desperate relatives remains unclear in the historical record. The outbreak of 1374 eventually subsided, though the records do not tell us exactly when or how. The dancers simply stopped, one by one, collapsing into exhausted sleep or death. The chroniclers moved on to other calamities, other horrors, but the dancing plague had only retreated, not vanished. It returned in 1418, in Strasbourg, though this earlier Strasbourg outbreak remains less documented than the famous one a century later. Small outbreaks flickered across the German states and the Low Countries throughout the 1400s, like embers that refused to fully extinguish. In 1463, another significant wave struck, this time primarily affecting the territories around the Upper Rhine. The patterns remained eerily consistent. People began to dance, unable to stop, convinced they would die if they ceased their frenzied movements. Yet each outbreak had its own peculiar character, its own local flavor of horror. In some towns, the dancers flocked to churches, continuing their wild movements before altars and shrines, their feet pounding on sacred ground until blood smeared the stones. In others, they avoided religious buildings entirely, as if some instinct told them that holy ground would offer no sanctuary. Some dancers maintained an eerie silence, their faces blank, moving with mechanical precision that suggested minds that had fled far from their bodies. Others screamed continuously, howling prayers or curses, or simple wordless cries that echoed through medieval streets. The variations suggest something crucial and deeply unsettling. These were not people following a script or mimicking behavior they had heard about. Each outbreak seemed to emerge independently, following some internal logic that adapted to local circumstances while maintaining core similarities. It was as if the same disease could manifest differently depending on the soil in which it grew, the same madness wearing different masks. Some dancers insisted they had to continue until they broke through some invisible barrier, until they reached the other side of their torment. Others believed they were being punished for sins they could not name or remember. A few claimed they had made bargains with forces they regretted, though what those bargains entailed, they could not or would not say. The testimonies that survive are fragmented, filtered through the pens of monks and magistrates who had their own interpretations and agendas. Were these connected phenomena? The question haunts historians who study the dancing plagues. The skeptical view suggests coincidence, that similar social and environmental conditions in medieval Europe could independently trigger similar psychological breaks. Times of plague, famine, and religious fervor created populations under extreme stress, pushed to the edges of what human minds could endure. Perhaps the dancing manias were simply the breaking point, manifesting in similar ways, because human psychology, when shattered, follows predictable patterns. But the alternative possibility whispers more darkly. What if these outbreaks were connected by something we cannot see in the historical record? Information traveled slowly in medieval Europe, but it did travel. Stories of the Aachen dancers would have spread, carried by merchants and pilgrims, monks and wandering laborers. Could the knowledge that such a thing had happened before create a kind of template, a cultural script that disturbed minds could follow? Or was there something deeper, some understanding of human vulnerability that allowed this particular form of madness to take root wherever conditions align? The geographic pattern offers tantalizing hints. The outbreaks clustered in particular regions, the Rhineland and the Low Countries, areas connected by trade routes and shared cultural traditions. These were places where religious movements and heresies flourished, where new ideas about sin and salvation circulated freely. The same regions that produced mystical movements and flagellant brotherhoods also produced the dancing plagues. Perhaps the intensity of religious feeling that characterized these areas created minds primed for this particular form of breaking. The triggers varied, or seemed to. Some outbreaks followed years of famine or plague. Others erupted during times of relative prosperity and peace, suggesting that material conditions alone could not explain them. What remained constant was the compulsion, the inability to stop, the sense that stopping meant death or damnation or something worse than either. Modern medical theories attempt to explain the dancing plagues through ergot poisoning, mass psychogenic illness, or various neurological conditions. Each theory has merit and holes. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces compounds similar to LSD, could cause convulsions and hallucinations, but the sustained, coordinated dancing seems beyond what ergot poisoning typically produces. Mass psychogenic illness can spread through communities, but rarely persists for weeks or months. Neurological conditions might explain individual cases, but not the synchronized outbreak of hundreds or thousands. What terrifies across the centuries is not just what happened, but that it kept happening. The dancing plague was not a singular aberration, but a recurring feature of medieval life, predictable in its unpredictability. People in 14th and 15th century Europe lived with the knowledge that at any time, in any town, the dancing might begin again. Imagine that dread. Imagine watching your neighbor begin to twitch, to sway, to step and leap and spin. Imagine wondering if you would be next. The last major outbreak was that famous Strasbourg episode in 1518, the one that history remembered best because it was documented most thoroughly. After that, the dancing plagues faded from European history, but they did not disappear entirely. Isolated cases continued to be reported into the 17th century, scattered and strange. The phenomenon simply lost its epidemic character, becoming rare rather than recurring. Why did it stop? We do not know. Perhaps the cultural and psychological conditions that enabled the dancing plagues shifted as Europe moved from medieval to early modern periods. Perhaps new forms of social control and medical intervention prevented the spread. Or perhaps it simply went dormant, waiting for the right conditions to return, lurking in the collective unconscious like a virus that never quite dies. The dancing plagues reveal something unsettling about the human mind and the human body. They show us that under certain conditions, we can lose control of ourselves in ways that seem impossible until they happen. They remind us that there are forms of suffering that transcend individual experience, that can spread through communities like wildfire through dry grass. And they demonstrate that history does not move in straight lines toward progress and enlightenment, that the past contained horrors we have not fully explained or understood, and perhaps never will. The bodies kept dancing in 1518, but the answers remain frozen in uncertainty 500 years later. When modern scientists turned their attention to the streets of Strasbourg, they expected to find clarity. What they discovered instead was a labyrinth of competing theories, each compelling enough to seem true, each flawed enough to remain uncertain. The dancing plague has become science's riddle, a medical mystery that grows more complex with every attempt to solve it. The first explanation came wrapped in the seductive promise of simplicity. Ergot poisoning, scientists proposed, could explain everything. The theory seemed perfect, almost too perfect. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in wet, cool conditions. When ground into flour and baked into bread, it becomes an invisible poison, spreading through entire communities with every meal. The fungus contains alkaloids similar to lysergic acid diethylamide, the compound that would later be synthesized as LSD-DOAL. Medieval Europe had seen ergot poisoning before, knew its terrors under names like St. Anthony's fire. Victims experienced convulsions, hallucinations, a sensation of burning skin, and uncontrolled muscle spasms. The symptoms seemed to align perfectly with what happened in Strasbourg. Historians and toxicologists built elaborate cases for ergot. The summer of 1518 had been cool and damp, ideal conditions for the fungus to flourish on rye crop. Strasbourg's poor, the primary victims of the dancing plague, would have consumed large quantities of cheap rye bread. The convulsive movements, the apparent madness, the inability to stop moving even unto death, all of it could be explained by ergotism. Scientific papers were published. Textbooks repeated the theory as fact. For decades, ergot poisoning was the answer, the mystery solved, the case closed. But then researchers began looking closer, and the elegant theory started to crumble. The first problem was duration. Ergot poisoning produces acute symptoms that last days, perhaps a week or two at most, depending on exposure levels. The dancing plague persisted for months. Frau Troffea danced for nearly a week straight before others joined her, and the epidemic continued well into September. Ergot victims, once removed from the contaminated food source, recover relatively quickly. The dancers of Strasbourg showed no such pattern. They danced until they collapsed, recovered slightly, then rose to dance again. The compulsion seemed to deepen over time rather than diminish. The second flaw cut even deeper. Ergot poisoning causes gangrene in the extremities, a constriction of blood vessels that leads to blackened fingers and toes, sometimes entire limbs. It produces a burning sensation so intense that victims would plunge their hands into ice water, seeking relief. The historical records from Strasbourg, detailed as they are, mention no such symptoms. The dancers suffered exhaustion, injuries from falling, worn feet from endless movement, but no burning, no gangrene, no vascular constriction. Their skin didn't blacken. Their limbs didn't die. They simply danced. The third problem emerged from the nature of the movements themselves. Ergot causes convulsions, violent spasms, jerking motions without pattern or purpose. Witnesses in Strasbourg described dancing, actual dancing. The movements followed rhythm, responded to music. When authorities brought in musicians, believing music might cure the afflicted, the dancers moved in time with the drums and pipes. This was not the random thrashing of poisoned nerves. This was coordinated movement, however frenzied, however endless. And then there was the geographic problem. If ergot explained the dancing plague, why did it happen in Strasbourg and nowhere else? Other cities consumed rye bread from the same region. Other communities faced the same cool, damp summer. Yet only Strasbourg danced. The specificity of the outbreak contradicted the randomness of fungal contamination. By the late 20th century, the ergot theory, once so convincing, lay in ruins. Scientists needed a new explanation. Enter John Waller, a historian of medicine at Michigan State University, who proposed something far more unsettling than poisoned bread. Mass psychogenic illness, he argued, could explain everything ergot could not. The human mind, under sufficient stress, can manifest physical symptoms without any biological cause. Entire groups, bound by shared beliefs and circumstances, can experience the same compulsions, the same physical reactions, spreading person to person through social contagion, rather than chemical exposure. Strasbourg in 1518 existed in a state of collective trauma. Famine had stalked the region for years. Syphilis, that new and terrifying disease, ravaged the population. The plague, never truly gone, erupted in sporadic outbreaks. Widespread poverty ground down the common people, while the wealthy seemed untouched. The church preached about divine punishment, about sins being repaid in suffering. In the squares and markets, preachers warned of saints who could strike you with curses, force you to dance as punishment for wickedness. Saint Vitus, in particular, was believed to inflict uncontrollable dancing on those who earned his wrath. Waller argued that Frau Troffea, living in this pressure cooker of stress and supernatural belief, entered a dissociative state. Her mind, unable to process the overwhelming anxiety, manifested a physical compulsion. She believed, on some level below conscious thought, that she had been cursed to dance, and so she danced. When others saw her, already primed by the same stresses, the same beliefs, the same fears, their minds followed suit. The dancing became contagious, not through fungus or bacteria, but through shared psychology. Modern neurology supports the possibility. Conversion disorder, as it's now called, can produce real physical symptoms: paralysis, blindness, uncontrolled movements, all without any organic cause. The brain, essentially, converts psychological distress into physical manifestation. Dissociative states allow people to act in ways that seem beyond their control, their conscious mind disconnected from their moving body. Mass psychogenic illness has been documented repeatedly in modern times. In Tanzania, in 1962, a laughing epidemic spread through schools, forcing them to close for months. In 2011, multiple girls in New York began experiencing tics and seizures, all psychological, all real in their physical effects. But if mass psychogenic illness explains Strasbourg, it raises questions as disturbing as the plague itself. Could the mind truly drive the body to dance for days without stopping, even unto death? Conversion disorder usually produces symptoms that protect the sufferer in some way: paralysis to avoid confrontation, blindness to avoid seeing trauma. Why would the mind create a compulsion that kills? And why did some people prove immune? The plague affected dozens, perhaps more than 100 at its peak, but not everyone. If shared stress and belief were sufficient, why didn't the entire city dance? Neurological explanations attempt to bridge the gap. Some researchers propose that extreme stress can trigger seizure-like activity in the motor cortex, creating genuine uncontrolled movement. Others point to the trance states induced by rhythmic motion, suggesting the dancers entered a kind of self-perpetuating loop, the movement itself altering brain chemistry, releasing endorphins, creating a dissociative high that overrode pain and exhaustion. The body dances, the brain enters a trance, the trance compels more dancing, round and round, until physical collapse breaks the cycle. Yet another theory points to the stars, or rather, to what medieval people believed about the stars. Astrological medicine dominated medical understanding in the 16th century. The alignment of planets, the position of constellations, these were thought to directly influence health and behavior. Some researchers note that 1518 saw unusual astronomical events, conjunctions, and alignments that astrologers of the time considered particularly ominous. Could mass belief in astrological influence have created a self-fulfilling prophecy, people dancing because they believed the stars compelled them to dance? Environmental factors beyond ergot have been proposed. Heavy metal contamination in water supplies, other fungal toxins, even early forms of encephalitis, brain inflammation that might cause movement disorders. Each theory assembles its evidence, marshals its arguments, points to this record or that symptom, and each theory fails to explain everything. The ergot poisoning hypothesis cannot account for the duration, the specific symptoms, or the geographic isolation of the outbreak. Mass psychogenic illness struggles to explain the lethality, the apparent inability of victims to stop even when facing death. Neurological explanations lack the diagnostic tools to prove what was happening in brains 500 years gone. Astrological theories depend on belief systems we no longer share, making them impossible to test or verify. Environmental factors leave no trace in the historical record specific enough to confirm or deny. Modern science, for all its tools and knowledge, stands before the dancing plague of 1518, much as the authorities of Strasbourg stood before Frau Troffea in July of that terrible summer. We watch, we theorize, we argue among ourselves, but we cannot definitively say what happened. The mystery has not been solved. It has merely been reframed in modern language, dressed in contemporary understanding, while remaining fundamentally unknowable. This is what makes the dancing plague so deeply unsettling. We like to believe that science can explain everything, that given enough time and research, all mysteries yield to reason. But 500 years of investigation have brought us no closer to certainty. Every answer generates new questions. Every theory illuminates some aspects, while casting others into deeper shadow. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that multiple factors combined in ways we can barely imagine. Stress and belief, creating psychological vulnerability. Environmental factors, triggering neurological susceptibility. Social contagion, spreading the compulsion through networks of shared experience. The dancing plague might not have a single cause, but rather a convergence of causes. Or perhaps, whispers the part of us that still fears the dark. Perhaps there are phenomena that resist explanation, events that exist at the boundaries of understanding, where the neat categories of science break down. The dancing plague asks us to accept uncertainty, to acknowledge that some questions may never be answered, some mysteries may never be solved. The dancers of Strasbourg have been silent for 5 centuries, their bodies long turned to dust, their suffering ended. But the questions they left behind continue to dance through the minds of historians, physicians, neurologists, and psychologists. Each generation brings new theories, new perspectives, new hopes of finally explaining the inexplicable. And each generation, so far, has failed. The dance continues, in the archives and academic journals, in the tension between competing theories, in the fundamental mystery that refuses to resolve. What caused the dancing plague of 1518? We may never know. And that uncertainty, that gap in our knowledge, might be the most unnerving legacy of all. We stand now at the edge of an abyss that has never truly closed. 5 centuries have passed since Frau Troffea stepped into that Strasbourg street and began her fatal dance, yet we remain no closer to understanding what possessed her mind and body in that moment. For all our advances in neuroscience, psychology, and medicine, the dancing plague of 1518 remains stubbornly, disturbingly unexplained. And perhaps what troubles us most is not that we cannot explain what happened then, but that we cannot guarantee it will not happen again. The answers we've constructed feel inadequate when held against the horror of the historical record. Ergot poisoning, mass hysteria, stress-induced psychosis. Each explanation illuminates a corner of the mystery, but leaves the center dark. We can list contributing factors, we can trace social conditions, we can theorize about belief systems and collective psychology. But none of this tells us what it felt like to be compelled beyond all reason to dance, until your feet bled, until your heart gave out, until death itself intervened. None of this explains the look that must have been in Frau Troffea's eyes when she could not stop. What haunts us is the implication that somewhere beneath our rational minds, beneath our sense of self and agency, lies something vulnerable to forces we do not understand. The dancing plague reveals that the boundary between control and compulsion is far more fragile than we dare to admit. These were not people who chose to dance. They were seized by something that overrode their will, their survival instinct, their desperate desire to stop. Their bodies became instruments playing a song they could not hear, choreographed by mechanisms we still cannot identify. And the phenomenon never disappeared. We simply gave it new names, cataloged it in medical journals, studied it from a comfortable distance. In 1962, in Tanganyika, laughter swept through a girls' school like wildfire. It began with 3 students giggling uncontrollably. Within days, 95 students were afflicted, laughing until they wept, unable to attend classes, some laughing for weeks without relief. The school closed. The contagion spread to other villages. Before it burned itself out, more than 1,000 people across multiple communities had been consumed by laughter they could not stop. Sound familiar? In 2011, in Leroy, New York, teenage girls began to twitch and convulse, their limbs jerking with movements they could not control. The outbreak spread through the school, ultimately affecting nearly 24 people. Neurologists found nothing. Environmental tests revealed nothing. Yet the movements continued, the contagion real, even if the cause remained invisible. The symptoms were as genuine as the dancing had been 5 centuries before. Could it happen today? Could the right combination of stress, belief, and social conditions create another dancing plague in our modern world? We want to believe we are immune, that our scientific understanding serves as protection, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Mass psychogenic illness continues to emerge in communities under strain, continues to spread through social networks, continues to defy our neat explanation. We are not so different from the people of Strasbourg. We are still bodies, housing minds we do not fully understand, still vulnerable to forces that operate beneath conscious awareness. The questions persist, unanswered and unanswerable. What does it mean that hundreds of people could simultaneously lose autonomy over their physical movements? What mechanism allows compulsion to spread from mind to mind, from body to body? How does belief translate into physical symptoms so severe they can kill? We frame these as historical questions, but they are present questions, future questions. They cut to the heart of what we are, of how much control we truly possess over ourselves. Frau Troffea is gone, her story reduced to a few lines in the historical record. We do not know her age, her circumstances, what she was thinking in the moments before she began to dance. We do not know if she felt her control slipping away gradually or if it vanished all at once. We do not know if she was terrified or exhilarated or numb, and we will never know. The only certainty is that she danced, and others followed, and some of them died, and we still do not understand why. The dancing plague of 1518 stands as a monument to the limits of human understanding. It reminds us that consciousness remains largely unmapped territory, that the relationship between mind and body harbors mysteries we have barely begun to explore. It suggests that under the right conditions, the self we think we know can dissolve, can be overridden by something we cannot name or control. And that possibility, that vulnerability, remains with us still, waiting in the shadows of every stressed community, every moment of collective crisis, every gathering where belief and fear and exhaustion converge. The music that compelled them has long since faded, but somewhere in the architecture of human consciousness, the capacity to hear it remains. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.